Hi, welcome to my channel. My name's Rubes, if you haven't been here before. If you have, you'll know that I tend to talk about scientific things and political things, and most often it's science from a political perspective or politics from a science perspective. And today it's sort of a bit of both. If you know me personally, or if you know about my work, you'll know that I am very empiricist. I really believe in evidence, but I am also very subject to my own passionate political perspective. So I try to straddle the worlds of science and social justice to bring, on the one hand, the cold scientific logic, but also, on the other, the heat of my passion for justice into all the different areas of my work. So, perhaps as a consequence of this, often colleagues who share my politics but not so much my scientific background will ask me certain types of questions. And the most common of these questions, at least in the last year or so since all the political upheavals that we've been going through, is why it's difficult for people in modern political discourse to understand the perspective of those on the other side as anything other than stupid or ill-intentioned. Indeed, it's something I myself undoubtedly struggle with. Only a couple of months ago, the subject of the Black Lives Matter protests in the US came up in conversation with an acquaintance who denied that there was any racism in the USA anymore at all. And I completely lost my cool. I shouted at him, I called him racist, I called him some other words that I don't want to repeat on YouTube. And here I want to talk about my political perspectives and political perspectives in general, actually, in a way that doesn't really take a side, or at least doesn't seem to. I absolutely do have a side, but I'm trying to understand these processes, and so I need to think about them dispassionately, and in particular about the abstract structure of certain political ideas, to search for ways that we, as left-wing people, can push passionately for positive change. Now, I'm not an expert on the psychology of political dialogue, so I'm going to approach this from a perspective that I do understand pretty well, which is the cognitive processes that are involved in understanding other people, and how these interact with our perceptions of ourselves. I'll put some recommended reading below in the description for those who want to learn more, or who want a formal academic reference for any of the arguments I'm presenting here. The first thing to understand is that when we interact with people, we tend to simulate their perspective alongside our own. In neuroscience, we call this perspective taking. And one interesting finding is that, for example, if you ask someone to report the perspective of a room, the presence of a cartoon person in the image whose perspective is different slows you down, but not if the cartoon has the same perspective as you. So this process of representing another person's perspective alongside our own seemingly tends to cause our internal representation of that person to overlap with our perception of ourselves. We begin to think of them as more similar to us, when the person whose perspective we are seeking belongs to a marginalised group. Perspective taking leads us to see them as more human, more relatable, and less like the stereotype of the group. I suspect that this is why men sometimes say to a close female friend, "You aren't like other girls," because by taking the time to understand her, he realises that she doesn't match the stereotype, because he sees her as a being similar to himself. But this reevaluation hasn't been extended to the whole social group of women. I recently read a really cool review of some of these issues by Sassenrath and colleagues, which again is in the description. And they argue, and I tend to agree, that when you try to take the perspective of someone whose whole worldview is so totally different from your own, the process of overlapping perceptions is hindered by the need to maintain a positive self-image. So, for example, if I have a conversation with a transphobic person, I'm not going to start thinking I'm actually just a broken man, and to see them as being too similar to me would threaten my ability to maintain a positive self-image. Because if they really are similar to me, then either they're right and I'm bad because I'm trans, or they're wrong, and then whatever has led them to be wrong, be it stupidity, selfishness, evil, or something else, must also apply to me. But what if your own identity doesn't come into it? What if the argument is between two white men one an all-right neo-Nazi, and one a lefty liberal or even a socialist. In my experience, left-wing people tend to evaluate their own moral worth in relation to their treatment of marginalised groups. Right-wing people tend to have other priorities. They may believe that those marginalised people are a threat to society in some way, or that spending money to reduce marginalisation is too much cost for not enough benefit. At the risk of slipping into the behaviour we're trying to understand, maybe they just don't see the marginalisation of those they fear. Here we can see that it runs both ways. If the other person is right, then I am wrong. If I am right and they are wrong, then seeing them as the same as me will force me to doubt the veracity of my own logic. In the case of political discourse, there is nothing worse to the moral compass of a left-wing person than to be racist, sexist, or basically in any way right-wing. We tend to see the intrinsic violence of these perspectives. So taking the perspective of a bigot is deeply uncomfortable because it forces us to think about the socio-political identities in a way that we find abhorrent, and may also highlight to ourselves our own privilege in the light of a far more extreme bigotry, which then upsets our self-image because we see bigotry as an immense moral failing. On the other hand, right-wing people's perspectives on lefties is that we are too soft, too sensitive, emotionally led, and that while our intentions may be good, our ideas are illogical and harmful. It seems like this comes into play especially in economic debates. In social debates, I think it's usually more like that we want to rip up society, which maybe in some limited sense we do. So to them, to want to change the structure of society, even just the bad aspects, is dangerous and irrational. So if they see us as being like them, they would risk seeing themselves as dangerously sensitive and irrationally emotional. That's just an example. As I say, it's hard for me, as just as much as anyone, to take the perspective of somebody who politically is my opponent. In the final case identified by Sassenrath and colleagues, there is a barrier to treating political opponents humanely, or at least as human beings, in cognitive terms, that stems from when one is successful in seeing them as similar to oneself. This might be summed up by a common mantra I've heard in the Nazi punching debate from around the time of Trump's inauguration, which goes something along the lines of, there's no question that Nazis are willing to use violence, so we need to steel ourselves and be willing to do so as well. This video isn't about whether it's okay to punch a Nazi, and frankly I don't think I'm qualified to take a firm position on that. But the fact that we say that about them suggests to me that they will also say that about us, and that seems to be a major fuel to political violence generally. So what can we do? How can this knowledge be more helpful, help us to be more politically persuasive? Can we find ways to make good on the central claim of democratic ideology that debate is an effective tool in seeking consensus and good policy? Or does this revelation actually mean we need to start thinking about ways to reinvent democracy? If you want to know more about any of these topics, or if you want anything to be discussed in a future video, let me know in the comments. I would encourage you to have a look at some of the things I've linked below. This has only been a very superficial look into political angles on perspective taking. And I hope that in the near future, when I next release a video, that it will be because you've suggested something interesting for me to talk about. Thanks, bye-bye.